Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for November 22nd, 2021. It was 58 years ago today that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, in an event that changed the course of history for the United States and for the world. The long-term effect of this was that the networks that were actually responsible for the assassination, whether you want to call them the shadow government, the deep state, the CIA assassination squad, whatever you want to call them, they were empowered and they have increased their stranglehold on behalf of their masters, the financial institutions of Wall Street and London, over every aspect of U.S. policy and global financial policy. But they also were able to carry out a transformation of the U.S. economy from a productive economy to a speculative system by getting Kennedy out of the way, and also change the foreign policy from the United States as an anti-colonial force in the world to being a full-fledged partner of the British Empire. Now, the official story, which has stood for 58 years, is in the history books. It is generally accepted by people in authority, is that the assassin was Lee Harvey Oswald, who acted alone. A lone assassin from the Texas Book Depository building who shot the president and was caught trying to escape, and then 2 days later he was assassinated under police custody in Dallas. Now, at the time, the president who replaced Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, set up a commission headed by former Chief Justice Earl Warren. And the chief organizer for the Warren Commission was Allen Dulles, who had been the head of the CIA when Kennedy came into office and was fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Now, in 1963, at the time of the assassination, 52% of the American people did not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. In the years that have passed, with the hundreds of books and studies that have come out, that the latest figures show anywhere from 63 to 73% of the American people don't believe Oswald was the assassin or that he acted alone. Now, there was an effort to release the documents. President Trump promised he would release the still classified documents from the Kennedy assassination. And in the 4 years he was president, he did release somewhere close to 19,000 documents, but more were kept classified. And the ones that were kept classified, the reason cited was national security, law enforcement, and foreign affairs concerns. This was a big mistake, and it was passed on to Joe Biden. And just last month, Biden delayed the release of the classified documents at least until December 15th, 2022. Now, the failure to release these documents means that the Warren Commission report still stands as the official explanation. More importantly, it means people who were involved in planning and covering up this assassination were given a free pass. And many of them are either dead or will soon die. The chances for a full explanation become increasingly remote as time passes. Now, one of the reasons this is so important is that when President Trump failed to have a public declassification of all the documents, he also failed to have a public release of all the classified documents related to Russiagate, the concocted story that he worked with Vladimir Putin to win the 2016 election. President Trump repeatedly insisted that that wasn't true. We know from a large amount of documentary evidence that has come out, including the recent revelations from the Durham investigation, which is plodding along at an unsatisfactorily slow pace. But we know increasingly that the actual collusion was between the Obama intelligence community, the U.S. media, British intelligence, and the Clinton campaign. I would argue that President Trump's failure to fully publicly declassify the documents from Russiagate played a very large role in the fact that we now have Joe Biden as president, because Trump failed to convince enough people, which he could have done with more documentation, that he was the victim of a regime change coup run by those networks. And they were running that regime change coup because they disagreed with his policies. So this failure to public release those documents means that people like Rachel Maddow, CNN, the Washington Post, and others can continue to peddle the fiction. And the Durham investigation has to move much more quickly, because these cover stories have to be exposed and the truth must come out. Now, one of the reasons this is so important is that today the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Harvey Oswald, is in Brussels, presenting the latest version of intelligence reports that are designed to prepare the United States and NATO to get into a new war. Now, just keep in mind the use of false flags from 9/11, the Iraq weapons of mass destruction, the Syrian moderate rebels, and so on, that have been used to keep the United States and our NATO allies in an ongoing war that has cost thousands of lives of Americans, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives actually of people whose nations we've invaded, and has cost trillions of dollars. And the fact that people who are using the intelligence to whip up the support for wars is costing all of us. And if it's not stopped, we'll be in another war. And if this war is against Russia or China, it may be the end of all wars, because it could go very quickly to nuclear weapons. Now, what Haines is showing our NATO allies is evidence, so-called, of the intelligence community that the Russians are preparing for an invasion of Ukraine. And what they say as the caveat is they're preparing for this if Putin decides to do so. They're claiming there are Russian troops massed on the border, there are more troops in preparation, that the Russians have an intent to do this, although Secretary of State Blinken said we don't know what Putin's intent is in massing troops. Well, to tell you the truth, we don't even know for sure if troops are massed. But if they are, maybe it has to do with the fact that NATO is carrying out one maneuver after another on Russia's borders, that there are naval maneuvers in the Black Sea, that last summer there was a near shootout between naval vessels near Crimea when the British crossed into Russian territorial waters. You have the role of NATO in U.S. and NATO in Ukraine in carrying out the coup in 2014, and you have the push to bring Ukraine into NATO today, which President Putin has defined as a red line. So maybe that's why, if the Russians are massing troops, that they don't trust what the U.S. and NATO are planning. You also have the regime change operation underway in Belarus, Russia's other neighbor, which is targeted for regime change and being brought into NATO. So with all of this out there, isn't it important that we finally get to the full expose of the networks that are using the intelligence community for wars, for such things as the Great Reset? These are all policies of a small group of oligarchs who have hijacked the United States, are controlling the United States and using the United States as a bludgeon against other nations which are acting as sovereign nations in opposition to the plans for a so-called New World Order that would be based on a global financial banker's dictatorship. So that's why the declassification of the Kennedy files are so important. That's why it's so important that the Russiagate files be released and that there be real transparency for once. Because what we've seen since the death of President Kennedy is that the United States is on a moral and cultural downturn, a degradation, which is taking with it the economy, the lives of our citizens, the education of our children, and destroying the traditions of the American Republic. 58 years ago was a turning point in this. And I think we should rededicate our efforts to exposing the corrupt cabal, including the role of the Dulles brothers, including the role of someone like John Brennan and Comey and Clapper in the Russiagate case, and especially the Hannigans from Britain, the Christopher Steeles, the Sir Richard Dearloffs, who are able to push buttons in the United States to get the government to do their bidding to protect their City of London empire. It's overdue that these documents come out. Get into the fight to demand that these come out. It's crucial for the future of civilization. Thanks for joining me today. Share this message, and I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll talk more about Project Ibn Sina to address the crisis that's facing the people of Afghanistan and the West, by the way, because if we don't resolve this humanitarian crisis, it will come back to bite us.